Last Tuesday, I walked into the conference room at Pacific Coast Logistics and delivered the news that would change everything. Richard Henley, my stepfather who once made me scrub floors while his own children received $50 weekly allowances, sat across from me as I announced his salary reduction. The man who taught me that hard work meant nothing if you weren't his blood, just learned that sometimes the kid you underestimate grows up to sign your paychecks. But this story doesn't start in that boardroom. It starts 16 years ago, when a 12-year-old girl realized that family doesn't always mean fairness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The summer I turned 12, my mother Carol married Richard Henley in a ceremony that felt more like a business merger than a wedding. I remember standing in my scratchy yellow bridesmaid dress, watching them exchange vows while his kids, Tyler and Madison, fidgeted in the front row wearing designer outfits that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Richard owned a mid-level management position at Northwest Industrial Solutions, and to my mother, recently divorced and struggling with 2 jobs, he represented stability. What I didn't know then was that stability for some meant servitude for others. The Henley house in Beaverton was everything our cramped apartment wasn't. 2 stories, a manicured lawn, granite countertops that reflected the afternoon light streaming through bay windows. Tyler was 14, already showing the entitled swagger that comes from never hearing the word no. Madison was 10, quiet but observant, with the kind of careful prettiness that suggested she'd learned early how to stay in her father's good graces. They welcomed me the way you might welcome a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the existing decor but would have to do. Richard made the rules clear during our first family dinner. He carved the roast with surgical precision while laying out what he called household expectations. Tyler and Madison would focus on their studies and extracurricular activities. Madison had piano lessons every Thursday, Tyler played varsity soccer, and both maintained honor roll status that earned them weekly allowances and weekend privileges. My role, he explained while passing me the smallest portion of meat, was different. I would contribute to the household through chores and part-time work, teaching me responsibility and the value of earning my place in the family. My mother nodded along, relief evident in her posture. She had found someone willing to provide for us, and if that meant I needed to work a little harder to prove my worth, well, that built character. Richard smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Even at 12, I understood the subtext. Tyler and Madison belonged here by birthright. I belonged here by sufferance, and sufferance required payment. The chore chart appeared on the refrigerator the next morning, written in Richard's neat handwriting. While Tyler's responsibilities included taking out trash once a week, and Madison was expected to keep her room tidy, my list covered 3 full columns. Dishes every night, laundry for the entire family on weekends, vacuuming the main floor twice weekly, cleaning both upstairs bathrooms, maintaining the yard, and assisting with meal preparation. The chart was color-coded, with my tasks in red ink while theirs were written in casual blue. I thought maybe this was temporary, a trial period to see how well I adapted to the new family structure. I convinced myself that once Richard saw how helpful I could be, once I proved I belonged, the workload would balance out. I attacked those chores with the determination of someone trying to earn their place at the table. I scrubbed grout with an old toothbrush until my fingers cramped, folded laundry with department store precision, and learned to operate the industrial-grade lawnmower that left my arms aching for days. Tyler and Madison watched my efforts with varying degrees of interest. Tyler seemed amused, occasionally making comments about how nice it was to have a live-in maid. Madison said nothing, but I sometimes caught her staring when I was on my hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between pity and confusion, as if she couldn't quite understand why I was doing work that in her world, people were paid to do. The allowance system became clear within the first month. Every Friday evening, Richard would call Tyler and Madison into his home office for what he termed their weekly review. They would present their report cards, discuss their activities, and receive their payments. Tyler got $60 a week, Madison $50, both amounts delivered in crisp bills that Richard counted out with ceremony. They used this money for movies, video games, clothes, and the kinds of casual luxuries that make teenage life bearable. I waited for my own weekly review, for some acknowledgement of the work I'd completed. Instead, Richard would nod approvingly at the clean house and mention how good it was to see me learning responsibility. When I finally asked about an allowance, he sat me down for what he called a teaching moment. The work I did wasn't a job, he explained. It was contribution to the family unit. Tyler and Madison received allowances because they were maintaining their academic performance while adjusting to a new family structure. My academic performance was expected, and my household contributions were simply the price of membership in a family that had graciously opened its doors. The logic was circular and airtight. I worked because I needed to earn my place, but the work itself was proof that I didn't deserve the same treatment as his children. It was a system designed to keep me running in place, always trying to catch up to a finish line that moved every time I got close. School became my refuge, the one place where Richard's rules didn't apply. I threw myself into every class, every assignment, every opportunity to excel. If I couldn't earn respect at home through chores, maybe I could earn it through grades. I maintained a perfect GPA, while my classmates complained about homework, because homework was the only work I did that anyone recognized as valuable. My teachers noticed my dedication, occasionally commenting on my maturity and work ethic, but they didn't know that maturity was really just exhaustion wearing a brave face. The summer before 8th grade, Richard announced that I was old enough for real employment. He had arranged a part-time position for me at his friend's landscape company, 3 days a week during school, and full-time during breaks. The pay was minimum wage, which Richard explained would go directly into a savings account that he would manage for my future education. Tyler, meanwhile, spent his summer at an expensive soccer camp, while Madison attended art classes at the community college. I reported to Green Valley Landscaping at 6 in the morning, where crews of mostly adult men loaded trucks with equipment and headed out to maintain commercial properties around Portland. My job was basic labor, pulling weeds, spreading mulch, cleaning equipment, and doing whatever tasks the crew leaders assigned. The work was hot, dirty, and physically demanding, but it taught me things that no classroom could. I learned that respect had to be earned through competence, not birthright. The crew treated me fairly once they saw I wasn't afraid of hard work. Miguel, the lead supervisor, became something like a mentor, teaching me proper techniques and occasionally sharing stories about building a life through determination and persistence. He never asked about my home life, but he seemed to understand that I was there for reasons beyond typical teenage employment. The other workers noticed things too. During lunch breaks, when I would eat the simple sandwiches I packed myself, while they shared elaborate meals their wives had prepared, I could feel their quiet sympathy. These were men who worked to support their families, who understood the weight of responsibility, and they recognized something familiar in my too serious demeanor and careful attention to every task. By the end of that summer, I had earned nearly $2,000, money that disappeared into the savings account Richard controlled. When I asked to see the balance or use some funds for school supplies, he reminded me that financial planning was an adult responsibility. The money was being invested for my future, he said, though he never provided any documentation or details about these mysterious investments. High school brought new challenges and new inequalities. Tyler received a car for his 16th birthday, a used but reliable Honda that gave him independence and social status. Madison got a laptop for her artistic pursuits, along with enrollment in a prestigious art program that cost more than most families spent on groceries. I received a card saying that my gift was the opportunity to continue building character through work and responsibility. The landscaping job expanded into year-round employment, with indoor work during winter months and additional responsibilities as I gained experience. Richard presented this as a tremendous opportunity, a chance to learn business operations from the ground up. What it really meant was that I worked 30 hours a week on top of maintaining my household duties and academic performance. I became an expert at managing time, doing homework in the company truck between job sites, and studying for tests during my lunch breaks. My classmates began to notice that I was never available for normal teenage activities. I missed school dances, couldn't attend football games, and rarely hung out on weekends. When they asked why, I developed a repertoire of vague explanations about family obligations and work responsibilities. The truth was too complicated and too humiliating to share. How do you explain that your stepfather believes in different rules for different children without sounding like you're making excuses? Some teachers expressed concern about my workload, particularly Ms. Rodriguez, my English teacher, who noticed that I sometimes fell asleep during first period. When she asked about my schedule, I gave her the same careful explanations I'd perfected with classmates. She didn't push, but she began allowing me to submit assignments electronically and occasionally provided extensions when she could see I was overwhelmed. The college application process revealed the true extent of Richard's financial manipulation. When I asked about accessing the savings account he'd managed for my education, he produced a statement showing a balance of just under $300. 4 years of landscaping work, 4 years of wages that should have totaled over $15,000, had somehow evaporated into what he termed management fees, tax obligations, and contributions to household expenses. I stared at that statement for a long time, sitting in Richard's office while he explained the complexities of financial planning and the costs of supporting a family.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The numbers didn't make sense, but challenging them would require resources and knowledge I didn't possess. At 17, I was trapped by the same system that had controlled me for 5 years, unable to prove what I knew in my bones to be theft. Tyler was heading to Oregon State University with a full financial package from Richard, including tuition, housing, and a generous monthly allowance. Madison was enrolled in an expensive arts high school that would prepare her for college applications to prestigious programs. I was informed that I would be attending Portland Community College while continuing to live at home and work for Green Valley Landscaping. College, Richard explained, was a privilege that had to be earned, and I hadn't yet demonstrated the maturity necessary for independence. The unfairness was breathtaking in its scope and casual cruelty. I had worked harder, longer, and with more dedication than either of his children, but the rewards flowed exclusively in their direction. Every achievement I earned through effort was minimized, while every advantage they received through birth was presented as natural and deserved. My mother watched these developments with the determined blindness of someone who had traded her daughter's welfare for her own security. When I tried to discuss the disparities in treatment, she reminded me how fortunate we were to have Richard's support and guidance. The conversation always ended the same way, with her suggesting that I should be grateful for the opportunities I'd been given and focus on making the most of them. Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, was the only family member who seemed to notice what was happening. During occasional visits, she would observe the household dynamics with sharp eyes and ask careful questions about my responsibilities and goals. I learned to give diplomatic answers, sensing that any criticism of Richard would find its way back to him and create problems for my mother. But Linda wasn't fooled by diplomatic answers. One afternoon, when Richard and my mother were out and Tyler and Madison were at their respective activities, she pulled me aside for a conversation that would change everything. She told me that she'd been watching the situation for years, that she understood exactly what was happening, and that she wanted to help me plan for a different future. Linda worked in human resources for a large logistics company, and she understood both corporate structures and educational opportunities in ways that my 17-year-old perspective couldn't grasp. She explained how I could leverage my work experience, academic performance, and determination into a path that didn't depend on Richard's approval or financial support. Over the following months, Linda became my secret ally and advisor. She helped me research scholarship opportunities, understand student loan processes, and develop a plan for genuine independence. More importantly, she helped me understand that the treatment I'd received wasn't normal or acceptable, that families were supposed to support all their children equally, and that Richard's behavior represented a form of abuse that was both subtle and devastating. The transformation in my understanding was gradual but profound. I began to see Richard's system not as tough love or character building, but as a deliberate strategy to maintain control and extract labor while providing minimal support. The financial manipulation, the unequal treatment, the emotional manipulation disguised as life lessons, All of it formed a pattern of exploitation that had shaped 5 years of my life. Armed with this new perspective and Linda's guidance, I began planning my escape from Richard's control. I researched state schools with strong business programs, applied for every scholarship and grant available, and quietly began the process of establishing my own financial independence. The plan would take 2 years to execute fully, but for the first time since my mother remarried, I had hope that extended beyond simply surviving until 18. The final months of high school passed in a blur of applications, interviews, and careful preparation. I maintained my household duties and work schedule while secretly building a foundation for a different life. Richard noticed my improved mood and congratulated himself on the success of his character-building program, never suspecting that his most obedient worker was planning a revolution. Graduation day arrived with the same fanfare Richard had provided for Tyler's ceremony, which is to say, almost none. While Tyler's graduation had been a family celebration with extended relatives, dinner at an expensive restaurant, and a gift of a new laptop, my ceremony was attended by my mother and Richard with the enthusiasm of people fulfilling an obligation. They sat in the back row, left immediately after the ceremony ended, and marked the occasion with a small cake from the grocery store. But I didn't need their enthusiasm anymore. I had Linda cheering from the third row. I had acceptance letters to Portland State University with enough financial aid to cover tuition and housing, and I had a plan that would take me far beyond the narrow confines of Richard's world. More importantly, I had begun to understand that success wasn't just about escaping his control. It was about building something better and eventually returning to prove exactly what his character building had really accomplished. 2 weeks after graduation, I moved into a dorm room that represented the first space that was truly mine in 5 years. It was small, shared with a roommate, and furnished with basic institutional furniture, but it was mine in a way that Richard's house had never been. I could study without interruption, sleep without worrying about morning chores, and begin the process of discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. College became the laboratory where I tested every lesson Richard had inadvertently taught me. His exploitation had given me an incredible work ethic, his financial manipulation had made me extremely careful with money, and his emotional abuse had taught me to read people's motivations with startling accuracy. What he'd intended as tools of control became the foundation for my success. I majored in supply chain management with a minor in business administration. Drawn to the field by my years of observing operations at Green Valley Landscaping, and my growing understanding of how businesses actually functioned. The coursework was challenging but manageable for someone who had learned to balance multiple responsibilities under pressure. While my classmates struggled with time management and study habits, I had systems refined through years of necessity. Professor Williams, who taught our foundational business courses, became an unexpected mentor when he noticed my unusual practical knowledge of operations and logistics. During office hours, I would ask questions that went beyond theoretical frameworks to real-world applications, demonstrating an understanding that typically came from years of industry experience. He began including me in research projects, and eventually recommended me for internships that would accelerate my career development. The internship at Pacific Coast Logistics during my junior year was supposed to be a part-time learning experience. Instead, it became a masterclass in corporate dynamics and a preview of my future. The company managed supply chains for manufacturers throughout the Pacific Northwest, coordinating the movement of goods from production facilities to distribution centers to retail locations. It was complex, fast-paced work that required both analytical skills and practical problem-solving abilities. My supervisor, Kevin Torres, was an operations manager who had worked his way up through the ranks over 15 years. He recognized something familiar in my approach to work: the careful attention to detail, the willingness to take on additional responsibilities, the quiet competence that came from proving yourself repeatedly. Within months, he was assigning me projects typically reserved for full-time employees and relying on my analysis for important operational decisions. The company's culture was merit-based in a way that felt revolutionary after years of Richard's arbitrary family hierarchy. Performance was measured through clear metrics, advancement was based on results rather than relationships, and everyone from entry-level workers to senior executives was expected to contribute value. It was everything Richard's household had pretended to be, but never actually was. During my senior year, Pacific Coast Logistics offered me a full-time position upon graduation, starting as a logistics coordinator with a clear path toward management roles. The salary was modest but represented more financial security than I'd ever experienced, along with benefits and opportunities for advancement that depended entirely on my own performance. I accepted immediately, understanding that this was the first step toward the kind of independence that Richard had spent years convincing me I could never achieve. Graduation from Portland State was a different experience entirely from high school. Linda flew in from Seattle, Kevin attended the ceremony as my guest, and Professor Williams made a point of congratulating me on both my academic achievements and my job placement. My mother and Richard were invited but declined, citing scheduling conflicts that prevented them from attending. Their absence felt like freedom rather than rejection. Starting my career at Pacific Coast Logistics was like stepping into a world where effort actually produced results. I worked long hours, but they were hours I chose in service of goals I'd set for myself. I tackled challenging projects, but the challenges led to recognition and advancement, rather than simply more work. Within 6 months, I was promoted to senior coordinator. Within a year, I was leading my own projects, and within 2 years, I was managing a team of analysts who looked to me for guidance and leadership. The work was genuinely fascinating in ways that landscaping had never been. I was optimizing transportation routes that saved companies thousands of dollars, coordinating complex logistics operations that kept entire supply chains functioning, and developing innovative solutions to problems that affected businesses throughout the region. Every day brought new challenges that required creativity, analysis, and leadership skills I was still developing. My colleagues treated me as an equal from the beginning, judging my contributions based on results rather than background or family connections. The collaborative environment was intoxicating after years of Richard's zero-sum household dynamics. Here, my success didn't diminish anyone else's opportunities, and other people's achievements didn't threaten my own position. It was a revelation that professional relationships could be based on mutual respect and shared goals. 3 years into my career, Kevin was promoted to regional director and recommended me for his former position as operations manager. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, supervisory responsibilities for a team of 12 people, and oversight of logistics operations for the company's largest clients. At 25, I was managing projects worth millions of dollars and making strategic decisions that affected the entire organization. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was succeeding in an industry that Richard understood well from his own career in operations management. My success was built on the same principles he claimed to value: hard work, attention to detail, and dedication to excellence, but applied in an environment that actually rewarded those qualities rather than exploiting them. Around this time, I began hearing rumors through industry networks about changes at Northwest Industrial Solutions, Richard's company. The manufacturing sector was facing increased competition from overseas production, and many companies were restructuring their operations to remain competitive. Several operations managers had been laid off, others had taken early retirement packages, and the remaining positions required updated skills in supply chain technology and lean manufacturing principles. I didn't seek out information about Richard's specific situation, but the logistics community in Portland was small enough that news traveled quickly. Northwest Industrial was struggling with outdated systems, inefficient operations, and management practices that hadn't evolved with industry standards. The company had hired consulting firms to recommend improvements, but implementation required operational expertise that their current management team apparently lacked. My own career continued its upward trajectory. By my 6th year at Pacific Coast Logistics, I had been promoted to senior operations manager, with responsibility for the company's largest accounts and most complex projects. My team had grown to include specialists in transportation optimization, warehouse management, and supply chain technology. We were consistently exceeding performance targets and earning recognition from both clients and industry organizations. The job also provided me with insights into the broader logistics industry, including the challenges facing companies like Northwest Industrial. I understood their problems from both operational and strategic perspectives, having dealt with similar issues for multiple clients. The solutions weren't particularly complex, but they required someone with current expertise in supply chain management and the authority to implement significant changes. When Pacific Coast Logistics decided to expand their consulting services to help struggling manufacturers improve their operations, I was chosen to lead the new division. The role came with another promotion to director level, a substantial salary increase, and the opportunity to work directly with senior executives at client companies. It was exactly the kind of position I had dreamed about during those long days, pulling weeds and scrubbing floors. The consulting work was intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding in ways I was still learning to appreciate. I was solving complex operational problems, implementing efficiency improvements that saved companies significant money, and building relationships with executives who valued my expertise. Each successful project enhanced my reputation and opened doors to even more challenging opportunities. It was during a quarterly industry meeting that I learned Northwest Industrial Solutions had hired Pacific Coast Logistics as their operational consultant. The project would involve a comprehensive review of their supply chain operations, recommendations for improvement, and implementation support for approved changes. As the Director of Consulting Services, I would be leading the engagement personally. The client list showed Richard Henley as the primary point of contact for Northwest Industrial's operations team. After 8 years of building my career, after 8 years of proving that his character-building program had been nothing more than exploitation disguised as family values, I was going to be his boss. The kid he'd convinced wasn't mature enough for independence was going to be evaluating his professional competence and determining his future with the company. I sat in my corner office, looking out at the Portland skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete, perfect justice. Richard had spent my teenage years teaching me that worth had to be earned through work, that family position didn't guarantee success, and that respect came only through proven competence. Now he was going to learn those lessons himself, taught by the student he'd never expected to succeed. The first meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning at Northwest Industrial's headquarters. I would be walking into Richard's workplace as the lead consultant hired to fix problems he hadn't been able to solve, carrying the authority to make recommendations that could affect his employment and career prospects. After 16 years, the power dynamic that had defined our relationship was about to reverse completely. I spent the weekend preparing for the engagement with the same thorough attention to detail that Richard had demanded for household chores. I reviewed Northwest Industrial's financial statements, analyzed their operational data, and developed preliminary assessments of their efficiency gaps. The company's problems were significant but solvable, requiring exactly the kind of systematic approach that I'd learned through years of proving myself in an industry that rewarded competence over connections. Monday evening, I called Linda to share the news that had been building for nearly a decade. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for: pride in my achievements, amazement at the poetic justice of the situation, and excitement about the opportunity to demonstrate how completely Richard had misjudged my potential. She reminded me that success was its own vindication, that proving him wrong was more powerful than any direct confrontation could be. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that seemed appropriate for the day I'd been unconsciously preparing for since I was 12 years old. I dressed in my best consulting attire, a tailored navy suit that projected competence and authority, professional but not intimidating. The outfit cost more than Richard had ever spent on my clothing during the 5 years I lived in his house, and it fit like the external expression of confidence I'd spent years developing. Pacific Coast Logistics had assigned Kevin Torres as my project partner, both because of his operational expertise and because he understood the personal significance of this particular engagement. We drove to Northwest Industrial's facility in comfortable silence, both of us aware that this meeting represented more than just another consulting project. It was the culmination of a journey that had started with a 12-year-old girl scrubbing floors and led to a professional woman with the authority to evaluate the man who'd never believed she'd amount to anything. The Northwest Industrial building looked smaller than I remembered from driving past it during high school, when Richard's job had seemed like an impressive achievement that my mother had been lucky to access through marriage. Now I could see it for what it was: a mid-sized facility with outdated signage and maintenance issues that suggested a company struggling to compete in a rapidly evolving industry. We were escorted to a conference room where Richard sat with 3 other operations managers. Reviewing our preliminary report, and preparing for the meeting that would determine their department's future. He looked older than I'd expected, grayer around the temples and heavier through the shoulders, wearing the slightly tired expression of someone who'd been fighting industry changes without the tools to win. When Richard looked up and recognized me, his expression went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, confusion, calculation, and finally a careful neutrality that I recognized from years of watching him manage situations where he wasn't entirely in control. He introduced me to his colleagues as Zoe Patterson, the lead consultant from Pacific Coast Logistics, without acknowledging our family connection. The name Patterson, my mother's maiden name that I'd reclaimed after college, probably helped maintain his professional composure. I opened the meeting with a comprehensive presentation of Northwest Industrial's operational challenges, supported by data analysis and industry benchmarks that demonstrated exactly how far behind the company had fallen. The issues were systemic: outdated inventory management, inefficient transportation routing, poor communication between departments, and management practices that prioritized hierarchy over results. Every problem I identified was something I could solve, and every solution would require Richard to acknowledge expertise he'd never recognized. The discussion that followed revealed the full extent of Northwest Industrial's operational difficulties. Richard and his team had been using the same approaches for years, resistant to changes that might require them to learn new systems or admit that their methods were no longer effective. They'd been focused on maintaining their positions rather than improving their performance, exactly the kind of thinking that my consulting work was designed to address. I outlined a comprehensive improvement plan that would modernize their operations, eliminate inefficiencies, and bring their performance up to industry standards. The plan was aggressive but achievable, requiring significant changes in both systems and personnel. Some positions would be eliminated, others would be restructured, and everyone remaining would need to demonstrate competence with new approaches and technologies. Richard asked careful questions about the implementation timeline and resource requirements, his tone professional but strained. He was clearly trying to assess how the changes would affect his own position, while maintaining the appearance of cooperative leadership. I answered his questions with the same measured competence I brought to all consulting engagements, providing detailed explanations supported by data and industry best practices. The meeting concluded with my presentation of the implementation schedule and performance metrics that would be used to evaluate progress. Richard's department would have 90 days to demonstrate improvement in key areas, with monthly reviews to track their success. Positions that couldn't adapt to the new requirements would be eliminated or restructured. The timeline was standard for this type of operational overhaul, but I could see Richard calculating whether he possessed the skills and flexibility to survive the transition. As the meeting ended and Richard's colleagues filed out of the conference room, he lingered behind, clearly wanting to address our personal connection. I waited for Kevin to gather his materials and step outside, leaving us alone for the first time since I'd moved out of his house nearly a decade earlier. Richard's opening gambit was predictable: surprise at my professional success, pride in how the character-building lessons of my teenage years had prepared me for achievement, and subtle suggestions that my current position somehow validated his approach to family leadership. He spoke carefully, testing whether I would maintain professional boundaries or acknowledge the personal history that hung between us like a storm cloud. I listened without comment until he finished his revisionist narrative, then responded with the same calm directness I used for difficult client conversations. I thanked him for his input on the operational assessment, confirmed that the implementation timeline would be strictly enforced, and noted that personnel decisions would be based exclusively on performance metrics and adaptation to new requirements. The conversation remained entirely professional, but the subtext was unmistakable. Richard tried one more approach, suggesting that our family connection might provide opportunities for informal discussion and collaboration outside the formal consulting process. I explained that professional ethics required maintaining clear boundaries between business relationships and personal history, and that all project communication would follow standard consulting protocols. The message was clear: he would receive exactly the same treatment as any other client, with no special consideration for family relationships that had never provided me with any advantages. The drive back to Pacific Coast Logistics was quiet, with Kevin understanding that I needed time to process the emotional complexity of the morning's events. The meeting had gone exactly as I'd planned professionally, but the personal satisfaction was more complicated than I'd expected. Seeing Richard struggle to maintain his composure while I controlled the conversation had been gratifying, but it also highlighted how much energy I'd spent over the years thinking about this eventual confrontation. That evening, I called Linda to debrief about the morning's meeting and plan for the implementation phase that would determine Richard's professional future. She listened with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched justice delayed but not denied, asking detailed questions about the operational changes I'd recommended and the likelihood that Richard could adapt successfully. Based on my assessment of his skills and flexibility, the outlook wasn't promising. The following weeks brought a series of follow-up meetings and progress reviews that gradually revealed the full extent of Northwest Industrial's management problems. Richard's department consistently failed to meet the benchmarks I'd established, struggling with new technology implementations and resistant to process changes that required abandoning familiar but inefficient approaches. Their performance metrics showed minimal improvement despite repeated guidance and additional resources. I maintained scrupulous professionalism throughout the implementation phase, providing the same level of support and expertise that I offered to all consulting clients. Richard received detailed feedback on his department's performance, specific recommendations for improvement, and access to training resources that could help him develop the skills necessary for success. The opportunity for adaptation was genuine, but it required acknowledging that his current approach wasn't working and committing to substantial changes. By the end of the 60-day evaluation period, it was clear that Richard's position needed to be restructured significantly. His department's performance had improved only marginally, he'd been unable to implement key technology upgrades, and his team's morale had declined due to his resistance to necessary changes. The operational assessment supported reducing his role from senior operations manager to project coordinator, with corresponding adjustments to his salary and responsibilities. The decision wasn't personal revenge, though the personal satisfaction was undeniable. Richard had been given the same opportunity as any other manager to demonstrate competence and adaptability when faced with industry changes. His failure to meet professional standards had natural consequences that any consulting engagement would produce. The fact that those consequences were being delivered by someone he'd spent years underestimating was poetic justice, but it was justice nonetheless. The final meeting where I delivered Richard's performance evaluation and new job description was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after our first encounter in the Northwest Industrial Conference Room. I would be recommending a 40% salary reduction along with significantly reduced responsibilities, changes that reflected both his department's poor performance and the company's need for more effective leadership. As I prepared for that meeting, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The 12-year-old girl who'd scrubbed floors while Richard's children received allowances had become the professional woman with authority to restructure his career. The teenager who'd been told she wasn't mature enough for independence was now making strategic decisions that affected an entire company's operations. Every lesson Richard had claimed to teach about earning respect through competence was about to be demonstrated in reverse. The meeting itself was brief and professional. Richard listened to my assessment of his department's performance, reviewed the documentation supporting my recommendations, and accepted the restructured position with the controlled resignation of someone who understood he had no viable alternatives. His new role would involve coordinating specific projects under direct supervision, with salary and benefits adjusted accordingly. I explained the decision with the same detailed analysis I provided for all personnel recommendations, citing specific performance metrics and operational requirements that supported the changes. Richard asked few questions, understanding that the evaluation was based on objective criteria rather than personal considerations. The professional competence he'd never recognized in a 12-year-old girl was now determining his own career prospects. As Richard signed the paperwork acknowledging his new position and reduced compensation, I felt the completion of something that had been building for 16 years. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship had finally reversed completely, not through revenge or manipulation, but through the simple demonstration of competence over time. The kid he'd convinced wasn't worth an allowance was now signing his paychecks. The consulting engagement concluded successfully, with Northwest Industrial's operations significantly improved and their competitive position strengthened. Several managers had adapted well to the new requirements and earned expanded responsibilities, while others had chosen to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Richard remained with the company in his reduced role, understanding that his career advancement would depend entirely on his ability to demonstrate the competence he'd been lacking. 6 months later, I received an industry award for the Northwest Industrial Project, recognition for implementing operational improvements that had transformed an underperforming company into a competitive organization. The award ceremony was attended by executives from throughout the Pacific Northwest logistics community, including several representatives from Northwest Industrial who credited our consulting work with saving their company from potential bankruptcy. Richard wasn't present at the ceremony, but I knew he would hear about the recognition through industry networks. The 12-year-old girl he'd sent to work in the yard while his children received allowances had just been honored for expertise that his company had needed, but he'd been unable to provide. Every assumption he'd made about potential and worth had been systematically disproven through the simple application of merit-based evaluation. The success of the Northwest Industrial engagement led to additional consulting opportunities throughout the region, establishing my reputation as someone who could solve complex operational problems and implement sustainable improvements. My career continued its upward trajectory, built on the foundation of competence and determination that Richard's exploitation had inadvertently strengthened. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Richard had indeed taught me valuable lessons about work, responsibility, and earning respect through performance. He just hadn't intended for me to learn them quite so thoroughly, or to apply them in ways that would eventually determine his own professional fate. The character-building program he'd designed to keep me in my place had instead prepared me to take his place, and then to demonstrate exactly why his approach to leadership had been fundamentally flawed. The 12-year-old girl who'd been told she needed to earn her place in the family had grown up to become someone who earned her place in the world through genuine achievement. The teenager who'd been convinced she wasn't mature enough for independence had developed into a professional who helped entire companies achieve the kind of operational maturity that Richard had never managed to demonstrate. 2 years after the Northwest Industrial Consulting Project concluded, I found myself standing in the lobby of a gleaming downtown Portland office building, waiting for an elevator that would take me to the top-floor executive suite. Pacific Coast Logistics had just been acquired by a national supply chain management corporation, and I was being promoted to regional vice president with oversight responsibility for operations across the entire Pacific Northwest. The acquisition had been driven largely by the reputation our consulting division had built through successful projects like Northwest Industrial. Our ability to transform underperforming operations into competitive advantages had attracted the attention of executives looking to expand their service offerings throughout the western United States. My track record of delivering measurable results while maintaining strict professional standards had made me a key retention target during the merger negotiations. The new position came with a salary that exceeded anything Richard had earned during his peak years, along with equity participation and bonus structures tied to regional performance metrics. More importantly, it provided authority over supply chain operations for dozens of companies throughout Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. The 12-year-old girl who'd been told she wasn't worth an allowance was now responsible for strategic decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of dollars in annual revenue. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was achieving this level of success in the same industry where Richard had struggled to maintain even mid-level management positions. The skills he'd claimed to be teaching through exploitation, work ethic, attention to detail, and earning respect through performance had become the foundation for advancement that he'd never been able to achieve himself. My first major initiative as regional VP involved developing a comprehensive improvement program for manufacturing companies struggling with operational inefficiencies. The program would provide consulting services, technology upgrades, and management training designed to help traditional manufacturers adapt to modern supply chain requirements. It was exactly the kind of systematic approach that could have saved Richard's career if he'd been willing to acknowledge his limitations and commit to genuine improvement. The program launch required assembling a team of operations specialists who could work with companies across various manufacturing sectors. I recruited talent from throughout the logistics industry, focusing on professionals who combined technical expertise with the communication skills necessary for effective consulting. The team included several people who'd worked their way up through operational roles, understanding both the theoretical frameworks and practical challenges of supply chain management. Kevin Torres accepted my offer to become the program's Director of Client Services, bringing his deep operational experience and understanding of how to implement changes in resistant organizational cultures. His background was similar to mine in many ways. He'd started in entry-level positions and advanced through demonstrated competence rather than connections or credentials. He understood the value of merit-based evaluation because he'd benefited from it personally. The first client for our comprehensive improvement program was a mid-sized electronics manufacturer in Eugene that had been struggling with inventory management and distribution efficiency. Their operations were typical of companies that had grown without updating their systems, relying on manual processes and institutional knowledge rather than integrated technology solutions. The assessment revealed problems that were systematic rather than personnel-related, requiring comprehensive modernization rather than simple staff adjustments. The Eugene project became a template for the broader program, demonstrating how thorough analysis and systematic implementation could transform struggling operations into competitive advantages. The client's performance metrics improved dramatically over 6 months, with cost reductions and efficiency gains that exceeded their most optimistic projections. More importantly, their management team developed capabilities that would sustain improvements long after our consulting engagement ended. Word of the program's success spread quickly through industry networks, generating requests for similar services from companies throughout the region. Many were facing the same challenges that had affected Northwest Industrial: outdated systems, inefficient processes, and management approaches that hadn't evolved with industry standards. The demand validated my belief that systematic improvement programs could benefit entire sectors rather than just individual companies. One request came from a familiar source. The new CEO at Northwest Industrial reached out to discuss expanding our previous engagement into a comprehensive modernization program that would address remaining operational challenges. Richard's former company had continued improving since our initial consulting work, but they recognized opportunities for additional advancement through more sophisticated supply chain integration. The follow-up engagement at Northwest Industrial provided an opportunity to observe the long-term effects of merit-based personnel decisions. The managers who'd adapted successfully to new requirements had been promoted to expanded roles with corresponding salary increases. Those who'd struggled with change had either left for positions better suited to their skill levels or accepted reduced responsibilities that matched their demonstrated capabilities. Richard was no longer with the company, having accepted the lateral position at a smaller manufacturer that I'd learned about through industry contacts. His replacement as operations manager was a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been promoted from within after demonstrating exceptional competence in implementing new processes. She'd started as a line supervisor 5 years earlier and earned advancement through consistent performance and willingness to learn new technologies. Patricia's success illustrated exactly what Richard's career could have looked like if he'd been willing to acknowledge his limitations and commit to genuine improvement. Instead of trying to maintain his position through political maneuvering and resistance to change, he could have embraced opportunities for professional development and earned advancement through demonstrated competence. His unwillingness to adapt had ultimately limited his options to positions that matched his actual skill level. The contrast was striking when I compared Patricia's approach to leadership with my memories of Richard's management style. She focused on developing her team's capabilities rather than maintaining hierarchy, measured success through objective performance metrics rather than personal loyalty, and treated advancement as something that had to be earned through competence rather than something that was owed based on tenure or relationships. Her team's performance reflected these leadership differences. Productivity metrics exceeded company standards, employee satisfaction scores were consistently high, and turnover rates were minimal. People wanted to work for someone who recognized and rewarded genuine achievement, who provided opportunities for growth based on merit rather than favoritism, and who maintained fair standards that applied equally to everyone. The success of Patricia's management approach validated everything I'd learned about the difference between genuine leadership and arbitrary control. Richard's household had been based on the same flawed principles that had ultimately limited his professional advancement. Rules that served the leader's convenience rather than developing everyone's potential, rewards that reflected relationships rather than performance, and evaluation systems that were neither fair nor consistent. My own leadership style had been shaped by understanding what effective management looked like when compared to Richard's negative example. I focused on developing team members, capabilities, provided advancement opportunities based on demonstrated competence, and maintained evaluation standards that were both rigorous and fair. The results spoke for themselves through consistently high performance across all areas of responsibility. The consulting program continued expanding throughout the region, with each successful engagement generating additional requests for similar services. A reputation for delivering measurable improvements while maintaining strict professional standards had established Pacific Coast Logistics as the preferred partner for companies serious about operational transformation. The business growth was substantial, but more importantly, we were creating lasting improvements in regional manufacturing competitiveness. 6 months into my role as Regional VP, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a supply chain management conference in Denver. The presentation topic was Merit-Based Leadership in Operational Transformation, focusing on how objective evaluation and systematic improvement could revitalize struggling companies. The invitation represented professional recognition at a national level, acknowledgement that our regional successes had broader industry relevance. Preparing for the Denver presentation required reflecting on the principles that had guided both my personal career development and our consulting approach. The core theme was simple but powerful. Systems based on merit rather than favoritism produced better outcomes for everyone involved, including those who initially resisted objective evaluation. Competence was the only sustainable foundation for success in competitive environments. The presentation went well, generating substantial audience interest and several requests for follow-up discussions about implementing similar programs in other regions. National supply chain executives expressed particular interest in our ability to transform management cultures while delivering measurable operational improvements. The professional networking led to opportunities that would define the next phase of my career development. 3 days after returning from Denver, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about maintaining professional boundaries while managing personal history. Carol's voice was strained with barely controlled panic as she explained that Richard had been hospitalized following a heart attack. He was stable but facing an extended recovery period that would prevent him from working for several months. The family's financial situation had apparently deteriorated significantly since Richard's salary reduction and subsequent job change. Carol's part-time nonprofit work provided minimal income, Tyler was still living at home while pursuing additional training, and Madison's art career generated barely enough revenue to cover her basic expenses. Richard's medical bills and temporary disability benefits would create immediate financial pressure that they weren't prepared to handle. Carol's request was carefully phrased but unmistakable. She wondered whether there might be temporary consulting opportunities that could provide Richard with income during his recovery period, work that could be done remotely, and wouldn't require the physical demands of his current position. She suggested that his years of operational experience might be valuable for companies seeking guidance on efficiency improvements. The request revealed Carol's continued inability to understand professional standards and merit-based evaluation. Richard's operational experience was primarily with outdated systems and inefficient processes that modern companies were trying to eliminate. His resistance to change and poor adaptation to new technologies made him unsuitable for consulting work that required current industry knowledge and flexible problem-solving approaches. More fundamentally, hiring Richard for consulting work would represent exactly the kind of personal favoritism that undermined professional integrity. Consulting clients expected recommendations based on objective expertise rather than family connections, and any suggestion that personal relationships influenced our hiring decisions would damage the reputation we'd built through consistent competence and ethical standards. I explained to Carol that our consulting positions required specific qualifications and current industry experience that matched client requirements. All hiring decisions were based on documented competencies and proven track records of successful project delivery. While I sympathized with their financial challenges, professional ethics prevented personal considerations from affecting business decisions. Carol's response was predictable disappointment, mixed with subtle guilt manipulation. She suggested that successful people had responsibilities to help family members during difficult times, that professional success should enable generosity rather than rigid adherence to abstract principles. She reminded me of Richard's role in providing stability during my mother's difficult period after her divorce, framing his exploitation as kindness that deserved reciprocal consideration. The emotional manipulation was more sophisticated than Tyler's crude attempts, but it was based on the same fundamental misunderstanding of professional relationships and ethical responsibilities. Carol couldn't distinguish between personal charity and business decisions, between family support and consulting qualifications. She still believed that relationships should override competence when circumstances became difficult. I suggested that Carol might want to explore resources for families facing medical financial challenges, including hospital social services, community assistance programs, and insurance options that could help manage Richard's recovery costs. There were legitimate support systems designed for exactly their situation, resources that didn't require compromising professional integrity or creating conflicts of interest. The conversation ended with mutual politeness that masked fundamental disagreement about principles and responsibilities. Carol still believed that family connections should provide protection from economic consequences, that professional success created obligations to modify business standards for personal reasons. I'd learned that maintaining ethical boundaries was essential for both individual integrity and organizational credibility. 2 weeks later, Madison appeared at Pacific Coast Logistics again, this time with a more desperate energy that suggested the family's financial situation had worsened. She'd clearly prepared for the meeting more carefully than her previous visit, carrying a folder of documents and wearing business attire that projected competence rather than artistic creativity. Her approach was more sophisticated, but ultimately based on the same flawed assumptions about family privilege and professional obligations. Madison's presentation focused on Richard's potential value as a contract consultant for companies that needed institutional knowledge about traditional manufacturing processes. She'd researched our client base and identified several companies that might benefit from understanding how older systems had functioned before modernization. She argued that Richard's experience could provide historical context that would improve implementation strategies for technological upgrades. The argument was more thoughtful than previous family entreaties, but it misunderstood both consulting requirements and client needs. Companies hiring consultants wanted solutions to current problems, not historical explanations of how things used to work. Richard's knowledge of outdated systems was precisely what modern manufacturers were trying to move beyond, not something they would pay to understand better. More importantly, Madison's proposal would have required creating artificial consulting opportunities to address family financial needs rather than genuine business requirements. Our clients trusted our recommendations because they were based on objective assessment of their operational challenges, not because we were helping consultants' family members manage personal financial difficulties. I explained that consulting contracts were awarded based on specific client requirements and demonstrated consultant capabilities that matched those needs. All project assignments went through formal evaluation processes that assessed technical competencies, relevant experience, and track records of successful delivery. Personal circumstances didn't influence these professional decisions. Madison's response revealed frustration with principles she couldn't understand or accept. She accused me of hiding behind corporate policies to avoid helping family members, of prioritizing abstract professional standards over human relationships and immediate needs. She suggested that rigid adherence to merit-based evaluation was really a form of cruelty disguised as integrity. The accusation was both unfair and revealing. Madison couldn't distinguish between maintaining professional standards and personal vindictiveness, between objective evaluation and arbitrary punishment. She still believed that family relationships should provide exemptions from the same performance requirements that applied to everyone else, that success created obligations to modify standards for personal convenience. I thanked Madison for her concern about Richard's situation and suggested that they might want to explore legitimate employment opportunities that matched his actual qualifications and experience. Many companies needed project coordinators and operations assistants, positions that would utilize his strengths without requiring skills he'd proven unable to develop. The key was finding roles that aligned with realistic assessment of his capabilities. Madison left the meeting with barely concealed anger, clearly frustrated by my unwillingness to create special considerations for family members facing financial pressure. Her final comment was that she hoped I would someday understand the difference between justice and revenge, a distinction that apparently escaped someone who'd received monthly allowances while her stepsister worked for free. The irony of Madison's accusation was remarkable. She was describing the exact confusion between justice and revenge that had characterized Richard's household management for years. He'd convinced himself that exploiting my labor while rewarding his children's compliance was fair treatment based on different needs and capabilities. Now that merit-based evaluation was affecting his circumstances, suddenly objective standards seemed like revenge rather than justice. The family's inability to accept responsibility for Richard's professional limitations, while simultaneously demanding special consideration for their financial difficulties, revealed the same entitlement that had shaped their treatment of me years earlier. They still believed that relationships should override competence, that circumstances should modify standards, and that successful people owed them accommodations that they'd never been willing to provide. 3 months later, I learned through industry contacts that Richard had found part-time work as a project assistant with a small manufacturing company that specialized in maintaining older equipment for companies that couldn't afford complete modernization. The position matched his actual skills and experience, providing income that was modest but sustainable for someone with realistic expectations about career advancement. The work was probably more satisfying than his previous management positions had been, because it eliminated the gap between his capabilities and his responsibilities. Instead of struggling to implement changes he didn't understand or manage people with skills he lacked, he was performing tasks that utilized his genuine strengths. The reduced pressure and clear expectations might actually improve his job satisfaction and performance. Carol had adjusted to their reduced circumstances by expanding her nonprofit work into a full-time position that provided both income and benefits. The forced independence was apparently challenging but ultimately beneficial, giving her professional identity and financial contribution beyond managing household responsibilities. She was discovering capabilities she'd never had opportunities to develop during years of economic dependence. Tyler had completed his digital marketing training and found employment with a company that specialized in social media management for small businesses. The position required skills he'd actually developed rather than connections his family provided, and his performance was being evaluated through measurable results rather than personal relationships. The experience was probably educational in ways that years of allowances had never been. Madison had expanded her retail work into a management trainee position while continuing to pursue her art as a part-time interest rather than a full-time career expectation. The regular employment was providing financial stability and professional skills that complemented her creative pursuits. She was learning that earning money through consistent performance was different from receiving payments based on family status. The family's adjustment to merit-based economics was apparently difficult but educational. They were finally experiencing the kind of character building that Richard had claimed to value, learning lessons about work, responsibility, and earning respect through competence. The difference was that these lessons were being applied fairly rather than selectively, producing genuine growth rather than exploitation. My own career continued its trajectory toward national recognition and expanded responsibilities. The success of our regional consulting program had attracted attention from supply chain executives throughout the country, leading to opportunities for expansion into additional markets. The professional advancement was built on the same foundation of competence and integrity that had guided every previous step. The consulting division had grown to include specialists in multiple aspects of operational improvement, from technology integration to management training to financial analysis. Our reputation for delivering measurable results while maintaining strict ethical standards had established us as the preferred partner for companies serious about sustainable transformation. The business success validated every principle I'd learned about merit-based leadership and objective evaluation. Looking back on the past 2 years, I could see how completely Richard's exploitation had backfired on his original intentions. He'd tried to teach me that family position determined treatment, that relationships mattered more than performance, and that compliance was more valuable than competence. Instead, I'd learned that merit-based systems produced better outcomes for everyone, that objective evaluation was fairer than arbitrary favoritism, and that professional integrity required maintaining clear boundaries between personal and business considerations. The character-building program had worked, just not in the way Richard had expected. Every lesson about earning respect through work had been internalized more thoroughly than he'd intended. Every experience with financial manipulation had taught me to value transparency and fairness in compensation. Every instance of unequal treatment had demonstrated why objective standards were essential for sustainable success. The executive conference room on the 32nd floor of the San Francisco headquarters building commanded a breathtaking view of the Bay Area, but my attention was focused entirely on the presentation materials spread across the polished mahogany table. As Western Regional Director, I was preparing for the most significant announcement of my career, the launch of a comprehensive supply chain modernization program that would transform manufacturing operations across 12 Western states. The program represented an investment of over $150 million in operational improvements, technology upgrades, and management training designed to establish the Western United States as the most efficient manufacturing region in the global economy. My role would involve coordinating consulting teams across multiple states while maintaining the merit-based evaluation standards that had proven successful in Pacific Northwest markets. The scale of responsibility was extraordinary for someone who had started in entry-level positions just 8 years earlier. I would be overseeing operations that affected more than 3,000 companies, managing consulting teams in major metropolitan areas from Seattle to San Diego, and implementing strategic initiatives that would influence regional economic development for decades to come. The announcement was scheduled for Tuesday morning at the Western Manufacturing Leadership Summit in Las Vegas, where executives from throughout the region would gather to discuss collaborative approaches to international competitiveness. My presentation would outline specific programs that participating companies could implement to achieve operational excellence while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that made Western manufacturing unique. Preparing for the Las Vegas presentation required synthesizing lessons learned from hundreds of successful consulting engagements into frameworks that could be applied across diverse industries and organizational cultures. The core principles remained consistent: merit-based evaluation, systematic improvement, and objective performance metrics, but implementation strategies needed to accommodate varying company sizes and market conditions. The research phase revealed fascinating patterns in how different companies had responded to merit-based transformation initiatives. Organizations that embraced change quickly typically achieved dramatic improvements within 6 months, while those that resisted objective evaluation often struggled for years before accepting that traditional approaches were no longer sufficient for competitive success. Most interesting were the companies that had initially implemented merit-based systems reluctantly, but eventually became the strongest advocates for continued expansion of competence-driven approaches. These organizations had discovered that objective evaluation actually strengthened their cultures by eliminating the resentment and inefficiency that came from arbitrary favoritism. One case study was particularly relevant to the broader program we were launching. A family-owned aerospace parts manufacturer in Arizona had initially resisted our consulting recommendations because they conflicted with traditional hierarchy that placed family members in senior positions regardless of their technical qualifications. The transformation had been painful but ultimately successful in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. The Arizona company's experience illustrated how merit-based systems could strengthen family businesses rather than threatening them. Family members who earned their positions through demonstrated competence commanded genuine respect from employees and competitors, while those who accepted roles that matched their actual capabilities found work more satisfying and less stressful than maintaining positions they weren't qualified to handle. The transformation had also revealed hidden talent throughout the organization, with several non-family employees earning promotions to senior positions based on technical expertise and leadership capabilities. The expanded opportunities for advancement had improved employee retention while attracting high-quality candidates who wanted to work for organizations that rewarded competence rather than connections. Monday's flight to Las Vegas provided time to review final presentation materials while reflecting on the personal journey that had led to this professional pinnacle. The contrast between my current responsibilities and Richard's household exploitation was so dramatic that it sometimes seemed like experiences from different lifetimes rather than stages of a single career progression. The 12-year-old girl who had scrubbed floors while Richard's children received allowances had developed into an executive whose strategic decisions would influence economic development across 12 states. The teenager who had been told she wasn't mature enough for independence was now implementing programs that would affect hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in annual economic activity. More importantly, the experiences with Richard's arbitrary authority had provided deep understanding of why merit-based systems were essential for sustainable success. Every instance of favoritism had demonstrated the importance of objective evaluation, while every example of exploitation had reinforced the necessity of fair compensation for genuine contribution. The Tuesday morning presentation drew an audience of over 1,200 manufacturing executives, representing companies from aerospace and electronics to textiles and food processing. The energy in the convention center was electric, with people genuinely excited about collaborative approaches to improving regional competitiveness while maintaining the innovative spirit that characterized Western manufacturing. I opened with comprehensive data that demonstrated the collective potential for operational improvements across participating companies. Conservative projections indicated that systematic implementation of merit-based evaluation and modern supply chain technologies could increase regional manufacturing output by 43%, while reducing costs by an average of 28%. The presentation's central theme was that sustained competitive advantage required embracing change and evaluating performance objectively, creating regional culture where competence was rewarded regardless of traditional relationships or established hierarchies. Companies and regions that prioritized merit over convenience would thrive in increasingly competitive global markets. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with sustained applause and numerous questions that demonstrated genuine engagement with the strategic concepts rather than polite professional courtesy. Executives wanted specific guidance on implementing merit-based evaluation in their own organizations, particularly strategies for managing personnel transitions during operational modernization. One question came from the CEO of a large electronics manufacturer who was concerned about employee morale during the transition to objective performance evaluation. She asked how to maintain team cohesion while implementing systems that might result in significant personnel changes, seeking guidance on managing change in ways that preserved valuable institutional knowledge. My response emphasized the importance of transparent communication and genuine development opportunities, explaining that merit-based systems ultimately improved morale by creating environments where effort and competence were recognized and rewarded. Employees who initially resisted objective evaluation typically became strong supporters once they experienced fair treatment and advancement opportunities based on demonstrated capabilities. The discussion that followed revealed broad consensus that merit-based systems produced better outcomes for everyone involved, including employees who initially struggled with performance requirements but eventually developed new skills that qualified them for expanded responsibilities. The key was providing genuine support for improvement while maintaining clear standards that applied equally to everyone. After the presentation concluded, the networking reception provided opportunities for detailed discussions with executives who wanted to explore specific applications of merit-based leadership principles in their industries. Many had heard about our Pacific Northwest successes through industry networks and were eager to implement similar approaches in their own companies. The conversations were professionally stimulating and personally satisfying, representing validation of principles I'd learned through negative examples from Richard's household management. His arbitrary rules had taught me to value consistent standards, his favoritism had demonstrated why objective evaluation was essential, and his exploitation had shown me the importance of fair systems that served everyone's interests. Wednesday morning brought unexpected news that would provide perfect closure to the personal aspects of my professional journey. Kevin Torres called to inform me that Northwest Industrial Solutions, Richard's former company, had been selected as the flagship demonstration site for our new Western Regional Modernization Program. Their continued success following our initial consulting engagement had made them an ideal example of sustained improvement through merit-based management. The selection was based entirely on operational metrics and improvement sustainability, without any consideration of personal connections to previous consulting relationships. Northwest Industrial had earned recognition through consistent performance excellence rather than favoritism or special consideration, embodying exactly the principles that the broader program was designed to promote. Patricia Chen would be presenting their transformation story at upcoming industry conferences throughout the Western region, sharing specific strategies that had enabled sustained improvements in productivity, employee satisfaction, and competitive positioning. Her presentations would provide concrete examples of how merit-based evaluation could strengthen, rather than disrupt established organizational cultures. The irony was remarkable in its completeness. The company where Richard had struggled to adapt to modern operational requirements was now serving as a model for other organizations seeking to implement successful transformation strategies. His former position was being held by someone who had earned advancement through demonstrated competence, rather than political maneuvering or resistance to change. More significantly, the success story would be told by Patricia Chen, a woman who had started as a line supervisor and earned promotion to operations manager through consistent performance excellence. Her career trajectory illustrated exactly what Richard's advancement could have looked like if he'd been willing to embrace learning opportunities and adapt to evolving industry requirements. Thursday's conference call with the corporate board of directors provided an opportunity to present initial results from the Western Regional Program launch. Registration had exceeded projections by 37%, with companies throughout the region expressing enthusiasm for collaborative approaches to operational improvement and merit-based management training. The board was particularly interested in scalability metrics and potential for expansion into additional regions based on Western program results. Early indicators suggested that demand for systematic improvement services would support similar programs throughout the United States, creating opportunities for national implementation of merit-based consulting approaches. During the call, I was asked to present my assessment of key success factors that had enabled rapid program adoption and sustained improvement results. My response emphasized the importance of objective evaluation criteria, transparent communication about performance expectations, and genuine commitment to developing everyone's capabilities rather than simply replacing underperforming personnel. The board's questions revealed their understanding that merit-based systems required careful implementation to achieve optimal results. Simply announcing new evaluation criteria wasn't sufficient. Success required systematic training, consistent application of standards, and ongoing support for employees who were willing to develop new skills and adapt to changing requirements. Friday afternoon brought a visitor to the San Francisco headquarters that would test everything I'd learned about maintaining professional boundaries while managing personal relationships. Tyler appeared in the executive reception area, wearing business attire that suggested significant improvement in both his professional status and personal confidence since our last encounter. Tyler's demeanor was remarkably different from our previous interactions, more mature and less entitled, suggesting that experience with merit-based evaluation had changed his perspective on work and advancement. His request for a meeting was professional rather than desperate, indicating that he understood the importance of appropriate business protocols. I explained the decision with the same detailed analysis I provided for all personnel recommendations, citing specific performance metrics and operational requirements that supported the changes. Richard asked few questions, understanding that the evaluation was based on objective criteria rather than personal considerations. The professional competence he'd never recognized in a 12-year-old girl was now determining his own career prospects. As Richard signed the paperwork acknowledging his new position and reduced compensation, I felt the completion of something that had been building for 16 years. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship had finally reversed completely, not through revenge or manipulation, but through the simple demonstration of competence over time. The kid he'd convinced wasn't worth an allowance was now signing his paychecks. The consulting engagement concluded successfully, with Northwest Industrial's operations significantly improved and their competitive position strengthened. Several managers had adapted well to the new requirements and earned expanded responsibilities, while others had chosen to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Richard remained with the company in his reduced role, understanding that his career advancement would depend entirely on his ability to demonstrate the competence he'd been lacking. 6 months later, I received an industry award for the Northwest Industrial Project, recognition for implementing operational improvements that had transformed an underperforming company into a competitive organization. The award ceremony was attended by executives from throughout the Pacific Northwest logistics community, including several representatives from Northwest Industrial who credited our consulting work with saving their company from potential bankruptcy. Richard wasn't present at the ceremony, but I knew he would hear about the recognition through industry networks. The 12-year-old girl he'd sent to work in the yard while his children received allowances had just been honored for expertise that his company had needed, but he'd been unable to provide. Every assumption he'd made about potential and worth had been systematically disproven through the simple application of merit-based evaluation. The success of the Northwest industrial engagement led to additional consulting opportunities throughout the region, establishing my reputation as someone who could solve complex operational problems and implement sustainable improvements. My career continued its upward trajectory, built on the foundation of competence and determination that Richard's exploitation had inadvertently strengthened. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Richard had indeed taught me valuable lessons about work, responsibility, and earning respect through performance. He just hadn't intended for me to learn them quite so thoroughly, or to apply them in ways that would eventually determine his own professional fate. The character-building program he'd designed to keep me in my place had instead prepared me to take his place, and then to demonstrate exactly why his approach to leadership had been fundamentally flawed. The 12-year-old girl who'd been told she needed to earn her place in the family had grown up to become someone who earned her place in the world through genuine achievement. The teenager who'd been convinced she wasn't mature enough for independence had developed into a professional who helped entire companies achieve the kind of operational maturity that Richard had never managed to demonstrate. 2 years after the Northwest Industrial Consulting Project concluded, I found myself standing in the lobby of a gleaming downtown Portland office building, waiting for an elevator that would take me to the top-floor executive suite. Pacific Coast Logistics had just been acquired by a national supply chain management corporation, and I was being promoted to regional vice president with oversight responsibility for operations across the entire Pacific Northwest. Tyler's marketing consultancy was thriving, while Madison's design business had grown to include several ongoing corporate clients who valued her creative skills and reliable project delivery. The family's collective adjustment to merit-based economics had been difficult initially but ultimately beneficial for everyone involved. They had discovered capabilities and satisfaction that years of arbitrary allowances and unearned advantages had never provided, learning genuine lessons about work, responsibility, and earning respect through competence. Carol's reflection on these developments included acknowledgement that the household dynamics during my teenage years had been fundamentally unfair and potentially harmful. She expressed genuine regret for supporting systems that had exploited my labor while rewarding compliance from Richard's children, recognizing that differential treatment had been based on convenience rather than valid educational principles. The conversation concluded with mutual understanding that had taken years to develop. Carol had learned about professional standards through her own work experiences, while I had achieved success that demonstrated the value of merit-based evaluation and objective performance assessment. Both of us understood that sustainable relationships required honesty and fairness, rather than control and exploitation. 6 months later, I stood before an audience of 3,000 manufacturing executives at the National Supply Chain Leadership Conference in Chicago, delivering a keynote presentation on merit-based regional economic development. The Western Regional Modernization Program had exceeded every projected metric, with participating companies achieving average productivity increases of 41%, while maintaining employee satisfaction scores that were significantly higher than industry standards. The success had generated requests for similar programs throughout the United States, leading to my promotion to National Director of Operational Excellence, with responsibility for implementing systematic improvement initiatives across all domestic markets. The position represented professional achievement that exceeded anything I had imagined during those years of scrubbing floors and pulling weeds in Richard's household. More importantly, the success validated every principle I'd learned about merit-based leadership and objective evaluation through both positive examples and negative experiences. Richard's exploitation had inadvertently provided deep understanding of why fair systems were essential for sustainable success, while subsequent professional experiences had demonstrated how competence-driven approaches benefited everyone involved. The keynote presentation concluded with sustained applause and numerous requests for follow-up discussions about implementing merit-based approaches in additional industries and geographical regions. The professional recognition was satisfying, but the personal satisfaction came from understanding how completely the character-building program had succeeded despite Richard's intentions. rather than because of them. The 12-year-old girl who had been told she wasn't worth an allowance had become a national leader whose strategic decisions would influence economic development across the entire country. The teenager who had been convinced she wasn't mature enough for independence was now implementing programs that would affect millions of jobs and trillions of dollars in annual economic activity. The character-building program had worked perfectly, just not in the ways Richard had expected or for the people he'd intended to benefit. Every lesson about earning respect through work had been internalized more thoroughly than he'd planned. Every experience with arbitrary authority had taught crucial lessons about fair leadership, and every instance of exploitation had reinforced the importance of merit-based systems that served everyone's interests. Looking back on the entire journey from Richard's arbitrary household rules to national leadership in operational excellence, I could see how every experience had contributed to understanding the difference between genuine authority and arbitrary control. The negative examples had been as educational as positive ones, teaching essential lessons about competence, fairness, and the importance of systems that rewarded merit rather than relationships. The student had finally become the teacher, and the ultimate lesson was that justice didn't require revenge. It only required the patience to build competence and the opportunity to demonstrate it in environments where merit mattered more than favoritism. Richard's character-building program had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, producing exactly the kind of leader he'd claimed to value, while proving that his own approach had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The morning Richard walked through the doors of my corporate headquarters in Chicago, 15 years had passed since I'd last seen him face to face. He looked smaller than I remembered, grayer around the temples and wearing the careful expression of someone who understood they were entering unfamiliar territory, where old assumptions no longer applied. I was reviewing quarterly reports from our European expansion when my assistant announced that Richard Henley was in the reception area, requesting a meeting about potential consulting opportunities with Morrison Manufacturing Holdings. The irony was exquisite. The man who had once exploited my labor for free was now seeking paid employment from the company I'd helped transform into one of the most successful manufacturing conglomerates in the country. The meeting took place in my executive conference room, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Richard sat across from me at the mahogany table where I'd negotiated multi-billion-dollar transformation contracts, his folder of credentials looking remarkably thin compared to the comprehensive portfolios typically required for our consulting positions. His opening presentation was careful and professional, acknowledging the success I'd achieved while explaining his own career progression since leaving Northwest Industrial Solutions. The work with specialty manufacturing companies had provided valuable experience with traditional production methods, he suggested, knowledge that might be useful for companies seeking to understand historical context before implementing modernization programs. I listened without interrupting, fascinated by his attempt to reframe years of career stagnation as deliberate specialization in niche markets. The narrative was carefully constructed to avoid acknowledging the performance limitations that had necessitated his transition to reduced responsibilities, instead presenting his experience as strategic positioning for emerging opportunities in heritage manufacturing consultation. When Richard finished his presentation, I thanked him for his interest in our consulting programs and explained the evaluation criteria used for all candidate assessments. Technical competence was measured through comprehensive testing and practical demonstrations. Leadership effectiveness was evaluated through reference checks and simulated management scenarios, and cultural fit was assessed through extensive interviews with multiple team members. The requirements were standard for consulting positions that involved responsibility for multi-million-dollar client engagements and authority over teams of specialized professionals. Every consultant needed current industry knowledge, proven track records of successful project delivery, and demonstrated ability to adapt quickly to changing requirements and new technologies. Richard's expression during my explanation revealed his gradual understanding that the evaluation process would be exactly as rigorous as I'd described, with no special consideration for personal relationships or historical connections. The merit-based system that had once seemed harsh when applied to his performance at Northwest Industrial was now the standard he would need to meet for any consulting opportunity. I suggested that Richard might want to explore our training and certification programs before applying for consulting positions. explaining that many successful consultants had used professional development opportunities to bridge gaps between their existing experience and current industry requirements. The programs were demanding but comprehensive, designed to prepare participants for the kind of complex problem-solving that modern manufacturing consultation required. His response was polite but strained, clearly recognizing that the training programs would require acknowledging limitations he'd spent years avoiding. The suggestion that he needed additional preparation before qualifying for consulting work was exactly the kind of honest assessment that had created difficulties in his previous positions. The meeting concluded with mutual understanding about next steps and evaluation timelines. Richard would have the same opportunities as any other candidate to demonstrate qualifications through our standard assessment process, with advancement dependent entirely on performance results rather than personal considerations or historical relationships. After Richard left the building, I sat alone in the conference room, reflecting on how completely the dynamic between us had reversed through nothing more than consistent application of merit-based principles over 15 years. The 12-year-old girl who had scrubbed his floors was now in position to evaluate his professional competence, not through revenge or manipulation, but through the same objective standards applied to everyone seeking similar opportunities. The transformation felt complete in ways that went beyond personal vindication. Richard's request for employment represented acknowledgement that competence-based systems produced better outcomes than arbitrary hierarchies, that success required earning advancement through demonstrated capability rather than maintaining position through political maneuvering or resistance to change. 3 weeks later, Richard submitted his formal application for our consulting training program, along with documentation of his experience and references from previous employers. The application was processed through our standard evaluation system, with his qualifications assessed against the same criteria applied to all candidates seeking professional development opportunities. The assessment revealed significant gaps in current industry knowledge, particularly regarding supply chain technology and modern management practices that had become essential for effective consulting work. Richard's experience was primarily with traditional manufacturing methods that companies were trying to modernize rather than preserve, limiting his potential value as a transformation consultant. However, the evaluation also identified genuine strengths that could be developed through comprehensive training and practical experience. His understanding of traditional production processes provided useful background for companies transitioning from older systems, while his years of project coordination had developed organizational skills that could support consulting team effectiveness. The recommendation was acceptance into our 6-month certification program, conditional on successful completion of intensive coursework in supply chain technology, modern management practices, and consulting methodology. The program was designed to bridge exactly the kind of experience gaps that Richard's assessment had revealed, providing pathways for career transition when candidates demonstrated genuine commitment to learning. Richard's response to the conditional acceptance was gracious and professional, expressing appreciation for the opportunity, while acknowledging the substantial commitment required for successful program completion. His tone suggested understanding that the training would be demanding, and that advancement would depend entirely on his ability to master new concepts and apply them effectively. The certification program began 3 months later, with Richard joining a cohort of 15 professionals seeking to transition into manufacturing consultation from various industry backgrounds. The group included former plant managers, engineering specialists, and business analysts who had recognized that consulting required different skills than their previous roles had developed. The program's structure was rigorous and comprehensive, combining theoretical coursework with practical exercises and real-world consulting projects that provided opportunities to apply new knowledge under supervised conditions. Participants were evaluated continuously through examinations, project deliverables, and peer assessments that measured both technical competence and collaborative effectiveness. Richard's performance during the early weeks was steady but unexceptional, demonstrating willingness to learn while struggling with technological concepts that were new to his experience. His traditional manufacturing background provided useful context for some discussions, but his limited exposure to modern systems created challenges that required additional study and practice. The program's most difficult phase involved supervised consulting projects, where participants worked with actual client companies under the guidance of experienced consultants. Richard was assigned to a team supporting a family-owned electronics manufacturer that was implementing supply chain modernization similar to projects I'd led throughout the Pacific Northwest. His role in the consulting team was deliberately limited, focusing on documentation and coordination tasks that utilized his organizational strengths while providing exposure to advanced problem-solving approaches. The arrangement allowed him to contribute meaningfully while learning from colleagues with more current technical expertise and consulting experience. The client engagement revealed both Richard's potential value and his continuing limitations as a consulting professional. His careful attention to detail and systematic approach to project coordination were genuine assets that improved team effectiveness, while his outdated technical knowledge and resistance to unfamiliar approaches created occasional difficulties that required patient correction from team leaders. By the program's conclusion, Richard had achieved competent but not outstanding performance that qualified him for entry-level consulting positions with appropriate supervision and continued professional development. His evaluation recommended placement in project support roles that would utilize his strengths while providing opportunities for gradual advancement based on demonstrated growth and learning. The certification ceremony was attended by program graduates, their families, and consulting team leaders who would be working with new consultants on upcoming client engagements. Richard's completion of the demanding program represented genuine achievement that had required acknowledging limitations and committing to substantial professional development. During the reception following the ceremony, Richard approached me to express appreciation for the training opportunity and acknowledge how much his understanding of modern manufacturing had expanded through the comprehensive program. His tone was humble and professional, suggesting that the experience had provided perspective on the differences between traditional approaches and current industry requirements. The conversation was brief but meaningful, representing closure to dynamics that had shaped both our lives in different ways. Richard had finally experienced the kind of merit-based evaluation and development opportunity that should have been available throughout his career, while I had demonstrated that fair systems could provide advancement pathways for people willing to acknowledge limitations and commit to genuine improvement. Richard's first consulting assignment was with a team supporting Morrison Manufacturing's continued expansion into new markets, working under experienced consultants to implement the same systematic approaches that had transformed dozens of companies throughout our client base. His role was appropriate to his current capabilities, while providing opportunities for continued learning and gradual advancement. 6 months into his consulting career, Richard was performing competently in project coordination roles, while developing technical knowledge that qualified him for expanded responsibilities. His progress was steady rather than exceptional, but it represented genuine professional growth that had resulted from honest assessment and systematic development, rather than arbitrary advancement or family favoritism. The success validated everything I'd learned about merit-based systems, providing opportunities for everyone willing to earn them through demonstrated competence and continued learning. Richard's achievement wasn't diminished by its modest scope. He had found satisfying work that utilized his genuine strengths while contributing to organizational success through appropriate application of his capabilities. Looking back on the entire journey, from Richard's arbitrary household rules to his eventual integration into merit-based consulting systems, I could see how every experience had contributed to understanding the difference between fair evaluation and arbitrary control. The negative examples had been as educational as positive ones, teaching essential lessons about competence, development, and the importance of systems that served everyone's interests. The 12-year-old girl who had been told she wasn't worth an allowance had created employment opportunities for the man who had exploited her labor, not through revenge or manipulation, but through building systems that rewarded competence and provided pathways for genuine advancement based on demonstrated capability rather than inherited privilege or traditional hierarchy. The character-building program had succeeded perfectly, producing exactly the kind of leader Richard had claimed to value while demonstrating that his original approach had been fundamentally flawed. The exploitation that was supposed to teach subservience had instead prepared me to create fair systems that benefited everyone willing to earn advancement through competence and continued learning. Richard's successful completion of consulting certification and steady progress in project coordination roles proved that merit-based systems could provide opportunities for people at any stage of their careers, regardless of previous limitations or career setbacks. The key was honest assessment, genuine development opportunities, and fair evaluation that applied consistent standards to everyone seeking advancement. The transformation was complete not through Richard's punishment, but through his integration into systems that actually worked the way he had always claimed his household rules were supposed to work. The vindication came through building better approaches rather than simply criticizing flawed ones, through creating opportunities rather than denying them, and through demonstrating that fair treatment produced better outcomes for everyone involved. The student had become the teacher in the most complete way possible, not by rejecting everything Richard had tried to teach, but by implementing the principles he had claimed to value in ways that actually served their intended purposes. The lessons about earning respect through work, developing capabilities through challenge, and advancing through demonstrated competence had been learned thoroughly, just not in the ways Richard had expected or intended. The character-building program had worked beyond anyone's expectations, producing leaders who understood both the importance of merit-based systems and the compassion necessary to implement them fairly. The exploitation had become education, the arbitrary control had become systematic development, and the household hierarchy had become a template for creating organizations where everyone could achieve their potential through effort and competence rather than relationships and favoritism. In the end, Richard's greatest achievement wasn't his consulting certification or steady career progress. It was inadvertently preparing someone to build systems that were fair, effective, and sustainable in ways his original approach had never been. The 12-year-old girl who had scrubbed floors while his children received allowances had grown up to create opportunities where competence mattered more than connections, where effort produced proportional results, and where everyone willing to work could earn the respect and advancement that Richard had always claimed to value but had never actually provided. The email arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, 3 years after Richard had joined our consulting team as a certified project coordinator. The message was from Carol, writing to inform me that Richard had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease and would need to transition away from active consulting work within the next 18 months, as his motor control and cognitive processing declined. The news was sobering but not entirely unexpected, given Richard's age and the stress he'd experienced during years of career uncertainty before finding stability within our merit-based consulting framework. Carol's message was factual and professional, acknowledging the reality of the diagnosis, while expressing gratitude for the employment opportunities that had provided Richard with meaningful work during his final productive years. Her tone was remarkably different from our previous interactions, reflecting maturity and perspective that had developed through years of experiencing genuine merit-based systems rather than arbitrary family hierarchies. Carol had witnessed firsthand how fair evaluation and appropriate placement could provide satisfaction and dignity that artificial privileges had never delivered. The email included Richard's request for a meeting to discuss transition planning and potential legacy contributions he could make during his remaining time with the consulting team. His desire to handle the situation professionally rather than seeking special consideration demonstrated growth that had resulted from 3 years of working within systems that rewarded competence and integrity rather than political maneuvering. I scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday, allowing time to review Richard's performance records and contributions while considering appropriate ways to manage his transition that would serve both organizational needs and his personal dignity. The approach would need to balance compassion for his medical situation with the same professional standards that had guided every other personnel decision. Richard's consulting portfolio over the past 3 years showed steady competence in project coordination and documentation, along with gradual development of technical knowledge that had improved his value to client engagement teams. His work hadn't been exceptional, but it had been reliable and professional, contributing to successful client outcomes while providing him with satisfying employment that matched his capabilities. More importantly, his integration into merit-based consulting teams had demonstrated the effectiveness of fair systems in developing people's potential, regardless of their starting point or previous limitations. Richard had learned to work collaboratively rather than hierarchically, to contribute based on competence rather than authority, and to earn respect through performance rather than demanding it through position. The Tuesday meeting took place in my office, where Richard appeared calm but obviously affected by the weight of his diagnosis and its implications for his future. He'd prepared comprehensive documentation of his current projects and recommendations for ensuring smooth transitions that would minimize disruption to client engagements and team effectiveness. His presentation was thorough and professional, demonstrating the systematic thinking and attention to detail that had made him a valuable team member despite his technical limitations. Richard had clearly thought carefully about how to manage his departure in ways that served organizational interests, rather than simply accommodating his personal circumstances. The conversation that followed was both professionally productive and personally meaningful, representing closure to dynamics that had shaped both our lives in profound ways. Richard acknowledged the opportunities he'd received through our consulting programs, expressing genuine appreciation for training and employment that had provided purpose and dignity during difficult career transitions. More significantly, he offered insights about the transformation he'd experienced through working within merit-based systems that actually functioned according to their stated principles. The contrast with his previous work environments had been revelatory, demonstrating how fair evaluation and appropriate placement could create satisfaction and effectiveness that arbitrary hierarchies had never achieved. Richard's reflection on these experiences included acknowledgement of mistakes he'd made in his approach to family leadership during my teenage years, recognizing that the household dynamics had been based on convenience and control rather than genuine character development or educational principles. His tone was thoughtful rather than defensive, suggesting that years of merit-based evaluation had provided perspective on the differences between effective and ineffective leadership approaches. The apology that followed was both unexpected and meaningful, though it focused more on recognizing the unfairness of past treatment than seeking forgiveness or attempting to justify previous behavior. Richard seemed to understand that the arbitrary rules and differential treatment had been wrong regardless of their intentions, and that the positive outcomes I'd achieved had resulted from my own resilience rather than his guidance. The conversation concluded with agreement on a transition plan that would allow Richard to complete current projects while gradually transferring responsibilities to other team members over the next 12 months. The timeline would provide adequate notice for clients while ensuring that his departure didn't create operational difficulties or compromise project quality. Richard's final year with the consulting team was marked by continued professional competence and growing mentorship of newer team members who could benefit from his systematic approach to project coordination and documentation. His institutional knowledge and careful attention to detail provided valuable support for less experienced consultants, while contributing to overall team effectiveness. The mentorship role seemed particularly satisfying for Richard, providing opportunities to share knowledge and support others, professional development in ways that were genuinely helpful rather than controlling or hierarchical. His approach emphasized skill development and systematic thinking rather than compliance and deference, demonstrating growth in his understanding of effective leadership principles. During his final month with the company, Richard requested a meeting to discuss potential ways he could continue contributing to organizational success even after leaving active consulting work. His suggestions included developing training materials based on his project coordination experience and providing occasional guidance for new consultants who were learning systematic approaches to client engagement. The proposal was thoughtful and realistic, recognizing both his limitations and his genuine strengths, while seeking ways to remain useful without creating burdens or complications. Richard had learned to assess his own capabilities honestly and propose contributions that matched his actual potential rather than his preferred status or historical position. I approved a limited consulting arrangement that would allow Richard to develop training materials and provide occasional guidance for new team members, work that could be performed remotely and adjusted as his medical condition progressed. The arrangement provided continued income and purpose while serving genuine organizational needs rather than simply accommodating personal circumstances. Richard's departure from full-time consulting work was marked by recognition from colleagues who had appreciated his steady competence and collaborative approach to team projects. The farewell gathering was warm but professional, acknowledging his contributions while celebrating the merit-based culture that had enabled his successful integration into consulting work, despite his initial limitations. 6 months after Richard's transition to emeritus status, I received a letter that provided perfect closure to our complicated relationship and shared history. The handwritten note expressed gratitude for opportunities he'd received, while acknowledging the remarkable transformation in my own career and achievements since leaving his household 20 years earlier. The letter included reflection on lessons he'd learned through experiencing genuine merit-based systems that actually functioned according to their stated principles. Richard acknowledged that his original approach to family leadership had been fundamentally flawed, based on arbitrary control rather than effective development of everyone's potential, through fair treatment and appropriate challenges. Most significantly, he expressed pride in achievements I'd accomplished through building better systems than the ones he'd attempted to implement during my teenage years. The recognition wasn't seeking credit for my success, but rather acknowledging that positive outcomes had resulted from my own competence and determination, rather than his character-building program. The letter concluded with hope that the principles of fair evaluation and merit-based advancement would continue expanding throughout industries and organizations, creating opportunities for everyone willing to earn them through demonstrated competence and continued learning. Richard seemed to understand that his greatest contribution had been inadvertently teaching the importance of systems that actually worked, rather than simply claimed to work. 2 years later, news reached me through Carol that Richard had passed away peacefully, surrounded by family members who had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of earning respect through competence, rather than expecting it through relationships or inheritance. His final years had been marked by dignity and satisfaction that came from meaningful work and honest relationships, rather than artificial privileges or arbitrary authority. Tyler and Madison had both achieved genuine professional success built on capabilities they'd developed through merit-based systems, rather than family support or inherited advantages. Tyler's marketing consultancy had grown into a regional firm serving manufacturing companies throughout the Midwest, while Madison had established herself as a respected commercial designer whose work was sought after by businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest. Carol had continued developing her own professional capabilities, eventually becoming executive director of a nonprofit organization that provided training and placement services for displaced manufacturing workers. Her work embodied the same merit-based principles that had transformed our consulting approaches, helping people develop genuine skills and find appropriate employment rather than simply providing temporary assistance. The family's collective transformation demonstrated how merit-based systems could benefit everyone willing to embrace fair evaluation and work to develop their actual potential, rather than maintaining artificial privileges or expecting special consideration. Their success validated principles I'd learned through negative examples, while proving that positive change was possible at any stage of life or career development. Standing in my corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had led from scrubbing floors in Richard's house to directing international operational excellence programs that affected millions of jobs and trillions of dollars in annual economic activity. The transformation had been built on principles learned through both positive and negative examples, but the foundation was always merit-based evaluation and fair treatment that served everyone's interests. The consulting programs I'd developed had helped thousands of companies implement systematic improvements while providing advancement opportunities for people willing to earn them through demonstrated competence. The success wasn't just measured in productivity metrics or financial results, but in the satisfaction and dignity that came from working within systems that actually functioned according to their stated principles. Richard's inadvertent contribution to these achievements was providing negative examples that demonstrated exactly why fair systems were essential for sustainable success. His arbitrary household rules had taught me to value consistent standards, his favoritism had shown me the importance of objective evaluation, and his exploitation had reinforced the necessity of appropriate compensation for genuine contribution. The character-building program had succeeded perfectly, just not in the ways Richard had expected or intended. Every lesson about earning respect through work had been internalized more thoroughly than he'd planned. Every experience with arbitrary authority had taught crucial principles about effective leadership, and every instance of unfair treatment had demonstrated why merit-based systems were essential for both individual development and organizational success. The 12-year-old girl who had been told she wasn't worth an allowance had grown up to create employment and advancement opportunities for thousands of people, including the man who had exploited her labor. The vindication wasn't through revenge or punishment, but through building systems that actually worked the way Richard had always claimed his household rules were supposed to work. The student had become the teacher in the most complete way possible, implementing principles that Richard had claimed to value in ways that actually served their intended purposes. The transformation was complete not through anyone's downfall, but through everyone's elevation to levels of achievement and satisfaction that fair systems made possible when they were properly designed and consistently applied. Looking toward the future, I could see endless opportunities to continue expanding merit-based approaches throughout industries and organizations that were ready to embrace change and evaluate performance objectively. The principles had proven successful across diverse cultural and competitive environments, creating sustainable improvements that benefited everyone willing to earn advancement through genuine competence and continued learning. The legacy wasn't just professional achievement or personal vindication, but demonstration that fair systems could create opportunities for everyone, regardless of their starting point, family background, or previous limitations. Merit-based evaluation and appropriate development could transform lives and organizations in ways that arbitrary privileges and inherited advantages never could. Richard's greatest achievement, though he never intended it, was preparing someone to build systems that were fair, effective, and sustainable, in ways his original approach had never been. The exploitation had become education, the arbitrary control had become systematic development, and the dysfunctional household hierarchy had become a template for creating organizations where everyone could achieve their potential through effort and competence, rather than relationships and favoritism. The character-building program had worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations, producing leaders who understood both the importance of merit-based systems and the compassion necessary to implement them fairly. The vindication was complete, not through Richard's punishment, but through his eventual integration into systems that actually embodied the values he had always claimed to represent, but had never successfully implemented. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.